Hi everyone. This lecture is going to have two learning goals. The first is to understand how to write effective survey questions and response options. And the second is to understand how to design effective survey flow. All right, thinking just big picture about survey construction, there's three ideas that I want you to keep in mind. We're going to look at some very specific tips and tricks for how to write good questions, how to write good response options, how to organize things in a way that makes sense to participants. But kind of higher level than that, the way that I want you to approach and think about survey construction this semester is that it's both an art and a science. There's tips and tricks that we have to writing good survey questions and structuring things in a way that makes sense for participants. But it's also an art. It's really going to depend on the exact questions that you're asking, the exact audience that you're looking at, that you're having participate in your survey. Depending on the types of questions you're asking, the kind of survey flow that works in one context might not make sense for another context when you're asking different groups of questions, when you're asking different groups of people. And so there are some useful rules that are, kind of consistent across contexts, but everything is going to kind of vary depending on the very specific context in which you're working, the kind of topic that you're studying, and the audience that you're looking at. For example, the way that I'm going to study something with a young child is going to be different than the way I'm going to study something with a grandparent, for example. So I'm not going to ask the same questions to a 5-year-old that I would to a 85-year-old, even if I might be interested in similar things like what is the effect of media on friendships or something like that. And I think one thing as we dig into the nitty-gritty for some of these tips and tricks that gets lost is that some of this is really just common sense, that you want to ask questions that are clear, that people can understand, that when you read it actually makes sense to you. And so there's a bit of common sense that goes into a lot of this of just saying, hey, do I understand what this question is asking? If I don't, I probably want to ask a different version of the question. If I don't understand it, somebody else is not going to understand it. And then related to that, that once we have put a survey together, even if we have followed all the best practice advice that we can think of, it's still good to try to test out that survey with a few people, what we call pilot testing a survey, to make sure that your questions are actually making sense and that people know what you're looking for and they're able to provide you with meaningful data that you're actually expecting to get, and that you're not kind of getting a lot of missing data or people are answering questions in ways you're not expecting. So pilot testing and actually sending it out to like 5 or 10 people to see, hey, is it actually making sense? You'll get some good feedback to say, I need to tweak some of these questions, I need to change them. So it's an art and a science. There's a lot of common sense involved. What does it make sense to you, yes or no? And then actually verify that by sending it out to people and say, hey, does it make sense to other people when I actually ask them to answer it? Are they actually providing me with the data, the kinds of data that I was expecting to see that I'm actually going to be able to do something with? So all these three things we'll revisit at the end, but just keep these in mind because we're going to get a lot of nitty-gritty stuff. But these are the bigger picture things that I want you to be thinking about when we actually go to design our own survey this semester. When we're thinking about survey construction, when we're thinking about using survey methods, a lot of the kinds of questions that we're going to be asking people are what we call self-report measures. And this is exactly what it sounds like. It's measures that rely on participants to provide answers about themselves or about others. So I'm going to have you tell me how much did you use social media use yesterday. I'm going to have you tell me whether or not you're experiencing attention problems. So I'm not actually going to sit there and kind of watch you do these things, though I certainly could. I'm going to send you a survey and you're going to self-report these things to me. Now, you can imagine, just from that example of social media use and something like attention problems, that there are potential issues and biases that are going to emerge with these self-report kinds of questions. We've looked at some of these already this semester. They're going to have questionable accuracy. Do you actually remember how much you used social media yesterday? Influenced by memory, like are you counting the right things as social media and actually reflecting on those things? And social desirability. If you use social media a lot yesterday, are you actually going to be honest with me about how much you used it yesterday? Or are you going to underreport? Are you going to lie about it a little bit? So let's look at some more concrete examples here. So for example, I might have on a survey, I'd say, how many minutes did you spend on TikTok yesterday? You might say, well, it's easy to remember, whether or not I was on TikTok, but I'm having a pretty difficult time nailing down exactly how much time I spent on it. So I know I was sitting there, after I ate dinner between my two shows, I was kind of scrolling through TikTok, but I don't know if that was 5 minutes or if it was 20 minutes or if it was 40 minutes. And if yesterday was, maybe you had a day off of work, you had a day off of school, and you just kind of bed rotted, couch rotted all day, you might be embarrassed if you were kind of on TikTok for way more than you typically are, and you might not feel comfortable reporting a number that you feel like doesn't reflect who you are typically. And so you might underreport how much you used TikTok yesterday to try and save face, to try and look more socially desirable to a researcher. Now, an alternative approach, maybe a slightly fancier approach to say, I recognize that people are going to be bad at remembering or estimating how much they used different social media apps yesterday. And so instead, I'm going to say, hey, log into your screen time app on your mobile device, and you tell me how many minutes it says you spent on TikTok yesterday. And this is great because this is a much more theoretically objective measure of how much they were using TikTok yesterday. The limitations, though, is that not everybody is going to have that same app. So, for example, iPhones and Android devices have different kinds of apps that measure the kind of minutes you're spending on these different apps, and they portray those estimates in different ways. So it might not have the estimate for yesterday, but it might have the estimate for the entire week, for example. So you want to be sure that you're kind of asking about the right device when people are answering these questions. You don't give the screen time app question to Android users because it's called something else, which is escaping me at the moment, but you want to make sure you ask the right version of the question to the right user. Some people might have that app turned off, so even if you ask them to access it, they might not have actually allowed their phone to be calculating and reporting their screen time, so they might still have to rely on their best guess. And still, once again, they might lie. So you might be saying, hey, look at the number and tell me what it says. But again, if they're embarrassed by that number, they might not actually report what it says. And I could go a step further and say, okay, I'm not actually going to have them report to me what the screen time app says. I'm going to say submit a screenshot of that screen time app and send it to me. So I'm going to look at what it says and then use that number for your screen time use, for your TikTok use yesterday. And that would be really cool because, then, hey, they can't really lie about it. But you're introducing kind of a few other layers of difficulty that is going to, add potential sources of error to this study. So one is that they might do it incorrectly. So they might send you a screenshot of, they might try to send you the right screenshot, but they might accidentally send you a screenshot of something else. Maybe a screenshot of the wrong app or the wrong time frame. They might upload a file that's the wrong file. So they have the screenshot, but they upload a PDF of their syllabus or something like that. They might just outright refuse to do it and say, hey, that's too many steps, or hey, that's an invasion of privacy, I'm not going to do it. And so they might skip the question and not answer it, in which case you're losing out on some data. And they may just, drop out of the study. They may say, hey, that's a waste of my time. I'm not going to spend time doing that. I'm going to no longer participate in this study. So all these kind of different versions of self-report we can kind of imagine that are trying to kind of circumvent different issues that arise with that self-report measure, but all with their own associated kinds of issues. So we kind of take all of these things into consideration when we're designing our study. What issues are we willing to deal with? What errors are we willing to live with? And which ones do we really want to try to address, try to avoid? Again, this is where both the art and the science kind of come into play of what do I need in this particular study and what is the best, most effective way I'm going to get that information as accurately as possible from as many people as possible. Given these issues, you might say, if we know self-report has these biases embedded in it, why is it so common in the kinds of research we're doing? Well, it has many strengths that you can probably imagine. One is that it's really cheap and easy to implement on a large scale. If I don't have to sit in a room with somebody and actually watch them use social media and see what happens when they use social media, if I can just send a survey out to 1,000 people, I can get a lot more information a lot more quickly than if I'm going to have to sit in a room and watch 50 people individually scroll social media for 30 minutes or an hour or whatever it is. I can provide some insights that are maybe hard to obtain otherwise. So there might be, things we want to ask people about that we're not going to be able to get information on any other way. So especially if I'm going to ask about sensitive information or private information, like health issues or illegal activities or, these things that we might want to study but have difficulty actually observing in real life. I need to kind of ask people to divulge that information. I need to make them comfortable to be honest with me and actually provide that information to the study, because I might not be able to get that information any other way. Even if they might lie about it, I might want that kind of lie if that means I can actually study the thing that I want to study. Which, again, still not a great scenario, but we kind of take what we can get. And it's really great for exploratory or preliminary research. So, if I'm interested in something like social media and attention problems, and I want to see if these things go together, I might just want to do a quick survey first to see, do I actually see an association between these variables that I think should go together before I design a more expensive and more time-consuming and more complicated study to really establish that causal relationship, ruling out confounders, establishing the time order, doing an experiment, doing a longitudinal survey, whatever it might be. I might want to do that kind of exploratory, quick, cheap, and easy first step before I spend all the time and resources on this more complicated step. But obviously, the limitations we've been looking at, it's easy to fake or to lie. People do this in some cases because there's incentives tied to participating in studies in a lot of cases. And so they might just want to get a lot of money. They might participate in the study multiple times when they're supposed to only do it once, to get more money. So there are kind of financial incentives in some cases. It can be difficult to ensure that people are taking the study seriously. So if I'm not actually there watching them participate in my study, if they're doing it online somewhere else, I might have no idea whether or not they're, actually answering my questions the way that I would hope they do, giving it the attention that I think that they should. So difficult to ensure they're taking it seriously and also actually attending to it and paying attention to what the questions are asking and not just skipping through and providing, ridiculous information. Now we'll transition into just talking about some more specific nitty-gritty, fine-grained, what are the ways that we ask questions and how should we avoid asking questions when we're thinking specifically about self-report questions on a survey. There are two big buckets of questions, and that's going to be closed-ended questions versus open-ended questions. And these are probably no-brainers here, but a closed-ended question is going to provide you a finite set of choices. The reason we might often use these kinds of questions is that they're really easy to analyze when we pull our data set and actually try to look at what those numbers look like. They'll include things like what we call Likert type questions. These are ones that we've talked about already and that you've seen in some examples, is that these are scales with labeled points. Sometimes just the anchors at the beginning and end of the scale are labeled. The most common form being this kind of strongly disagree to strongly agree scale. And so that's very common in research, an easy way for us to translate people's estimates into numbers that we can statistically analyze, these 1 to 5 scales or 1 to 7 scales or sometimes 1 to 9 scales. So for example, I could say, how long did you use TikTok yesterday? And importantly, I could ask this in a closed-ended way or an open-ended way. The closed-ended way would be a case where I'm actually giving people a set of response options to choose from. So I'll show you an example in just a moment. But there's kind of a constrained list of options that they could choose from when answering this question. And then open-ended questions, conversely, provides few limitations to how participants are responding and thus allowing for greater variety and greater diversity in the responses that they're giving. The limitation here being that these are going to be more difficult to analyze, that if I'm letting them respond in all kinds of different ways, I'm going to have to try and make sense of all those different ways and try to consistently and systematically transform those open-ended responses into numbers that I can actually statistically analyze. So there's going to be an extra step in there. I can't just take these kind of estimates from 1 to 5 and analyze them. I'm going to have to turn this open-ended, in many cases, verbal description into numbers that I can actually do something with. So again, I could ask people the same question, how long did you use TikTok yesterday? But instead of giving them a list of possible responses, I just say, answer however you see fit. You can tell me in minutes, you can tell me in hours, you can tell me whatever you think. and we'll see what you say. The other possible benefit of this, maybe not so much in this example of how much did you use TikTok yesterday, but this can sometimes offer insights that you weren't otherwise expecting or thinking about in the way you were posing these questions. So if I'm asking you just like, what kind of TV shows were you watching yesterday? If I am kind of really directed in my study thinking about a particular kind of social media use or a particular kind of TV viewing, you might answer the question in a way that kind of signals to me like, oh, I hadn't thought about that kind of social media use, or I hadn't thought about that kind of television viewing. And so it might help you kind of reconceptualize the questions you're asking, or even provide you with data that you weren't expecting to get. And so there can be some benefits to using these open-ended questions, despite the fact that they are a little more difficult to analyze. Once we have posed or crafted our closed-ended question, there are some things we want to keep in mind about the response options we allow people to use. There's two things. It's that we want our response options to be both exhaustive and ideally mutually exclusive. When we say exhaustive, we mean that the response options include all possible answers or options for the given item, for the given indicator that I've posed. And when I say mutually exclusive, it means there's no overlap between between two or more items or response options in the actual survey. So let's take this example of how often did you use TikTok yesterday? If I gave people a constrained set list of options here for this closed-ended question, if I said less than 5 minutes, between 5 and 10, between 10 and 15, more than 30, this is a bit problematic because these buckets that people are going to be assigning themselves to are not mutually exclusive. So, for example, if I used social media for 10 minutes yesterday, do I assign myself to the between 5 and 10 minute category or to the between 10 and 15 minute category? And you'll see that there's also an issue with exhaustiveness here, is that there's this gap between 10 and 15 and 30 where, if I used social media for 25 minutes yesterday, you haven't given me the option to tell you that. You're going to force me to kind of put myself into this 15-minute bucket or this more than 30-minute bucket in a way that doesn't actually represent what I did yesterday. And so you're going to miss out on information and get potentially biased or inaccurate information. So in this case, we have an issue both with exhaustiveness and mutual exclusivity. To fix that, I might provide a list that looks like this. And this is a bit more complicated, but it solves these issues with exhaustiveness and mutual exclusivity. I could say, I did not use TikTok yesterday. I used it less than 14 minutes. I used it between 15 and 29 minutes, between 30 and 44 minutes, between 45 and 59, and more than 60 minutes. So in this case, regardless of where I fall on this continuum from 0 to 60 or more, there's an option for me to answer. I'm going to find a place for me to fall. You might say, well, what if they used it like 29 and a half minutes? Or like, in that case, that's maybe a little less of a problem with mutual exclusivity than when I just had no idea kind of which bucket in which I would fall. And here, kind of deciding where to draw the boundaries around each of these buckets, you could all come up with different ones. So you might do 5-minute buckets or 10-minute buckets rather than here, which I have 15-minute buckets. And that might just be based on research that has actually looked at how long people are using these things. You might see that, the average is 30 minutes and it tends to range from 0 to 60 and very few people are way over 60. And so you might say the response options I'm going to give are going to kind of limit people to these sets of responses. And so this could be a way of trying to resolve these issues with exhaustiveness and mutual exclusivity. When we think about the way that we're phrasing questions, in the way that we're asking, so not necessarily in the responses that we're giving, but just in the way that we're posing the question to participants, there are a couple things we want to keep in mind. The first is that we want to avoid leading questions. And this is cases where the item phrasing is going to cause participants to maybe feel compelled or motivated to respond in a particular way, potentially in a way that doesn't reflect their actual lived experience or their lived behavior. So think about something like, if I asked, how many days over the past month have you illegally engaged in underage drinking? Imagine I'm doing a study with teenagers. This is a somewhat leading question. I've really put some emphasis on, hey, if you're underage drinking, teenager, it's illegal. So you probably shouldn't be doing that. With that in mind, how often were you doing that over the past month? You would want to avoid doing that if you want honest answers from teenagers. So first, you want to design the study in a way that has made this teen pretty comfortable, being honest with you, maybe giving them certainty that I'm not going to go share this information with their parent or with their teacher or with their principal. But also in the way I phrase this question is going to be important. I maybe don't want to emphasize, hey, that's a really bad thing or a legal thing that you were doing. And I might want to use less biased language. I might want to say something like, on how many days over the past month have you had an alcoholic beverage? I might want to define alcoholic beverage. And again, I might want to design the study in a way that makes them comfortable being honest. But when we're thinking just about the question wording, we want to, as much as possible, avoid phrasing questions in a way that is going to kind of nudge people one way or the other, particularly when we're asking about sensitive issues or issues where social desirability might be a bias, so things like social media use. We also want to avoid what are called double-barreled questions. We want to avoid items that are trying to tap into multiple indicators, dimensions, or concepts at the same time. In essence, we want items to really just be addressing one idea at a time so that when people give us a response to that item, what they mean is kind of unambiguous. Like, we're not going to disagree about what they meant when they said 5 minutes on social media. We're going to know they meant 5 minutes yesterday on TikTok. We're going to know they meant 5 minutes yesterday on YouTube. And there's less ambiguity than just kind of these bigger picture questions. So for example, if I posed a question to people, maybe an agree-disagree scale, and said, rate your agreement with this item. I enjoy using social media platforms like TikTok, Instagram, and Snapchat. Rather than that big kind of, in this case, triple-barreled item, asking about 3 different kinds of social media use, I might say, hey, tell me your agreement with these 3 items. I enjoy using TikTok. I enjoy using Instagram. I enjoy using Snapchat. This is just going to make it less ambiguous. If somebody rates themselves as 4, 5, 5 on these 3 items, I know that the 4 is for TikTok, the 5 is for Instagram, the 5 is for Snapchat. Whereas if they rated themselves a 4 for that first item, I might be unsure, like, well, is that TikTok? Is that Instagram? Is it Snapchat? So as much as possible, when you can, trying to separate and parse apart these more complicated concepts into their individual dimensions by, in essence, using multiple items, multiple indicators. We also want to think about things like organizing the survey. So not just at the question level, but in what order are we actually presenting these questions to participants in our survey? So order effects are concerns where responses to one question might bias responses to a subsequent question. So it might change or nudge people in a way to answer following questions in a different way. So sort of like a leading question, but it's the flow of questions that have now led us and nudged us in one direction or the other. So for example, if I had a question like, hey, do you think using TikTok is bad for you? And then asked you, okay, and how many minutes did you spend using TikTok yesterday? You can imagine potential order effects here, that if I ask you, is using TikTok bad, before I ask you how much you used it, you might now be thinking about, oh, well, it looks bad if I use TikTok too much, and so I'm going to underreport how much I use TikTok now. We want to avoid doing that as much as possible, again, if we're trying to get honest feedback on honest experiences from people. So there's many ways you can try to resolve this issue. One is just, if there's clearly an order that's less concerning, use that less concerning order. Maybe having them report how much they used TikTok yesterday and then asking them what they think about TikTok is a less concerning order. You might think, well, I don't think that sequence of questions is going to lead to potential order effects in the same way that I think asking about, is it bad, before use would bias maybe your responses to those questions. So if there's a clear order that just makes more sense, again, the art of it, use the less concerning order. You can also randomize the order of questions. So if you really think this is going to matter, you could have some people answer, is it bad? And then how many minutes? And then the other half of your sample answer how many minutes? And then is it bad? And you could test to see, do those who got one order versus the other look different on the estimates they were providing? So do we actually have evidence that there was an order effect or not? And if there's not, then you don't have to worry about it. So randomizing the order can be good. And then you can potentially place these questions just in different chunks of the survey. So maybe early in the survey, I ask how many minutes you spent on TikTok, and then much later in the survey, I ask your opinion on TikTok. And you might think, if I've asked you a bunch of stuff in between, maybe that order effect is less concerning. And so kind of just by nature of separating the questions, putting them farther apart, potentially I'm feeling less concerned that this stuff is a problem. And then finally, just understanding another kind of question that we might be thinking about is that we might send our survey to lots and lots of different kinds of people, and we might not want everybody to answer every question, understanding that not everybody has the same experiences to tell us about. Not everybody is using social media, though for the most part, people are, but not everybody is using the same kinds of social media. And I might have specific questions for those who use TikTok and different questions for those who use YouTube and different questions for those who are on Reddit and so forth. And so I might want to use what we call filter questions that direct participants to answer only questions that are relevant to them. So I might first say, hey, have you ever used TikTok in the past month, or YouTube, or Reddit, or Instagram, or whatever social media I'm interested in, and have people say yes or no, and then funnel those TikTok users into a specific set of questions, funnel those Instagram users into a specific set of questions. And those follow-up questions are what we call contingency questions. These are questions that are only answered by a subset or smaller portion of our participants. So those who said, yes, I use TikTok, will then, okay, rate your agreement with these following items about TikTok. Those who said yes to YouTube will tell us about their experiences with YouTube and so forth. And this is important because we don't want to burden people with answering questions that don't apply to them, because that's going to make them frustrated. And then they're going to give us bad data. They might start lying to us or just kind of like skipping questions nonchalantly, whatever it might be. We really want to think about the survey experience and trying to make it as clear and streamlined as possible for the participants in our study. So revisiting, again, this big idea is that we have a lot of nitty-gritty kinds of things to keep in mind with the way we ask questions, the way we pose response options, the way we organize our questions, which questions are presented to which people. And that's all great. That's kind of the science of survey construction, that we know these things matter and that it's important to structure the survey in this way. But it's also an art. Depending on who you're asking and what you're asking, some of these things are going to look different. And so it really just depends. And that's why it's important for yourself as a just human being, when you read your survey, do you understand it? Is it clear? Can you get through it as quickly as you can? Is it as long as it needs to be, as short as it can be? And why it's important to pilot test. It's important to send that survey out to people and get some feedback and say, hey, are they actually able to answer the questions in the way that I expect? Do I have all the response options that I need? Are they all exhaustive? Are they all mutually exclusive? Are people feeling pressured by the way questions are phrased or the way they're organized? And all that feedback can be really, really useful to tweaking your survey, making changes before you actually spend all the money to send it out and get a big, big sample. So again, it's an art and a science. It should make sense to you, and you should double check that it also makes sense to others. So a lot of nitty-gritty stuff here, but the main points being is that we're trying to understand how to write effective survey questions, how to write effective response options, and then how to design effective survey flow, how to organize things in a way that makes it streamlined for people to answer and also easy and clear for people to answer. And they're going to be honest with you. That's really the most important thing here, is that you're going to be getting data that you're able to interpret, that you're able to analyze, and you're going to feel confident that you know what that data actually represents and what it means.